Scene. Boom. All right. Today's topic: should Democrats pack the courts? Now, I told both of you, I warned you, okay? When we argue this out, I want to hear both sides of this represented as fully as possible. You guys are not allowed to do some bullshit where you're like, oh yeah, I agree that we'll pack the courts and like it'll be okay, blah, blah. And then you like both agree on like some position that neither of you adhere to, or you will be executed. Okay. You have to fucking defend your goddamn topic. But I think that will be fine. Okay. So right now, the conversation topic is whether or not Democrats should pack the courts. And by pack the courts specifically, we're saying that should Biden win the election, should they expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court? And then either cap it with an amendment or just leave it expanded and open to more expansion in the future. Bastiat is arguing against that. You may be in favor of other changes to the Supreme Court, like term limits or whatever, but you are against the notion of Biden coming in and adding more justices. And socialism done left, who may also be in favor or against other things of the Supreme Court, you are in favor of Biden coming in and expanding the court, adding more justices. Whether he makes it impossible to do so in the future, whatever, is a different thing. But right, okay. So that's both of your positions. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Okay. All right. I've thought back and forth. So this is my pilot episode of this, so things are going to be a little bit more rough, or I'm going to be talking through like the processes a little bit more, just so I have an understanding of what works and what doesn't work. Some people do very strict formats on these, so like 1 minute opening speech, 35-second rebuttal, 20-second response, blah 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 blah. I'm not really as interested in that strict of a thing, but I will give each of you the opportunity at least to make a quick opening statement to kind of like represent your arguments. So if you'd like, Bastiat, you are arguing against packing the court. So if you want, I'll give you like just a minute. You don't have to use the full minute, but just like explain like roughly what your position is and then why you would be against packing the courts.
Okay.
Go.
Yeah, so I guess I'd follow the words of Justice Ginsburg, who said last year that, quote, if anything would make the court look partisan, it would be that one side saying, well, when we're in power, we're going to enlarge the number of judges so we would have more people who would vote the way we want them to. The Supreme Court has no army. The Supreme Court has no money. The only way they get people to do what they say is because people respect them and respect the fairness of their decisions. And in that sense, I think it's absolutely important the Supreme Court preserve its legitimacy, or rather that Congress not do anything to jeopardize fundamentally its legitimacy. Now, I recognize that there are arguments, certainly good arguments to be made that Republicans have done their part to delegitimize the Supreme Court through this process. But I think that's very different. For example, the process of appointing Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court after blocking Merrick Garland. But I think that's very different from a process of expanding the court for the clear purpose of getting a political majority that would turn the Supreme Court into a nakedly partisan branch that would erode its authority. And before long, one way or another, it would no longer be able to contribute meaningfully to our constitutional order because its authority would be eroded in the eyes of the people. And eventually Congress and the president would just begin to ignore it as convenient. So
okay.
my position is that.
Yeah. Okay. About a minute 15. All right. Socialism done left. You are arguing in the affirmative for whether or not Democrats should pack the courts. Go for it.
Sure. So the second part of that Ginsburg quote is she notes that it rests on that legitimacy, as you pointed out. So to a large degree, the court's legitimacy has already been mined. So again, I think that the basic way that we should look at this is a short term and a long term. So in the short term, the Republicans have already undermined the legitimacy of the court. They have expressed clearly that they are willing to do whatever it is necessary to achieve power on this court. I think I'm getting some feedback.
Yeah, wait. Bastian?
I think they
with me when you talk, but okay.
Yeah, my microphone was unplugged. You're all set.
It's all good. Sorry. Anyway, in short, the basic idea is that in the short term.
No, I'm fine. Just fucking with you. Go ahead.
In short, the basic idea is that in the short term, we need to gain more power on the Supreme Court because the Republicans have expressed a desire to use whatever methods they have, be it gerrymandering, be it not packing, but making sure that their candidates get on the Supreme Court through almost any means necessary. So the short term is that we need to get a little bit more power. The Democrats and people who are in favor of continuing United States need to get more power to achieve like short-term electoral reforms to make sure that democracy keeps functioning the long term. And the long term, the argument is that we should use the current moment of like packing the court to enact some of those reforms. We should use it as a leveraging power. Specifically, the argument that I find most convincing is that we should do something like appoint 2 justices, so we return it more or less to the status quo with 6 conservative, 5 liberal. So there'd be still a slight conservative majority, and threaten to appoint 2 more liberal if they don't enact a constitution. Am I lagging?
Nope, you're pretty good, I think.
Yeah,
okay.
Good.
All right. So I think based off your opening statements, I'm going to ask a question, and then I want you guys to talk it out, is what we're going to try, okay? So the first thing, given your 2 opening statements, I'm hearing is whether or not the legitimacy of the courts have already been undermined such that anything is basically permissible. So socialism then left. You brought this argument up. Do you want to go down that road? Why do you believe the legitimacy of the courts has been undermined? And then Bastiat, you can just respond. Go.
I mean, sure. So like we can just look at the increasing partisanship of the appointments. Like it went from in the 70s, people would be appointed like 98-2 or something. Today, every Supreme Court vote is a partisan vote. The same thing is true of the lower court votes. In addition to holding up Merrick Garland, the Republicans the largest vacancy in modern history for the lower courts. Trump appointed, I want to say it was like 25% of Court of Appeals justices because of this enormous set that the Republicans created. And so I think it demonstrates that Republicans have shown no commitment, and Democrats to some degree, true. I don't think this is like a one-sided thing, but in particular, Republicans especially have shown that they are extremely interested in pursuing power, even at the destruction of legitimacy. And so that the Supreme Court is so delegitimized that anything is permissible, I would still say that there's clearly some limits. Like I think some polling data on packing only like in favor, 50% opposed. So there's still some legitimacy in the eyes of the people. But I think that will tend to be eroded as it moves away from public opinion. There's a dozen studies I can show you. The Supreme Court generally tries to track public opinion. If it gets too far away, it's going to be really, really delegitimized, which it's going to be by ACB, unless we do some packing.
Okay, well, first I would say that the notion that it is going to be delegitimized by Amy Coney Barrett is still right now speculative. To say that she is going to act in a way that will fundamentally delegitimize the court, look, we only will know that whether, based on the rulings that she issues, and also importantly, how the other justices on the court respond. But I can tell you a little bit about the court's more recent history with respect to its legitimacy. First, you're right that votes for the Supreme Court are more partisan than they used to be. But I think that's also because people have started to realize that, people have realized over the last 30, 40 years that Supreme Court appointments are an excellent opportunity for fundraising, for posturing. These are really meaningful appointments that impact all kinds of issues. And as the public has taken more awareness of the Supreme Court, their representatives have similarly taken more awareness of the Supreme Court and voted accordingly. So I don't know that partisan voting is necessarily a problem with the Supreme Court. I think the problem is the extreme nature of the proceedings and how they've come to dominate a lot of our political process. But to get back to the point about legitimacy, the Supreme Court's decisions as of 2018. 25% of its decisions were divided 5-4, and about 50% of its decisions were unanimous 9-0. In 2018, there was 90% unanimity in the first 10 decisions of the Robert Court, which I looked back into the 1940s for this to go back to FDR. More unanimity than in any court set of decisions since FDR was president. So while the picture is more complex than this, the Supreme Court is not just some partisan, close deciding partisan institution. It's broadly actually unanimous. And it's also worth noting that beyond that, it's not so easy to say that a justice will vote one way or another in every particular case. For example, Neil Gorsuch was kind of a wild card in the recent decision with respect to same-sex discrimination in the workplace. Not just with respect to, it wasn't just same-sex discrimination in the workplace, it was also discrimination against transgender people. Mm-hmm. And he took a textualist reading of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 to come up with, I think, what was a relatively progressive opinion. Justice Kennedy's vote on gay marriage. And on the other side, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, one of her last decisions was a vote in support on a 7-2 decision to build a natural gas pipeline.
Can I ask a question real quick?
Yeah.
In terms of what, so sorry, because my alarm went off. You said that the first 10 decisions had 90% majority in 2018.
Yeah.
Why did you do the first 10 decisions? That makes
Well,
me wonder if
that was the study that I looked at here from SCOTUS blog, and apparently these are just really pressing decisions. I'll link it to you here if you want to check it out.
okay, no,
But
I was just curious
yeah,
because usually
that's
someone says like the first 10, it's like, oh well, the other
Mhm.
400 decisions or however
sure.
many they hear in a year were all
Sure,
yeah.
but even then, it's not only first 10,
Mhm.
but overall, it's
Yeah, sure.
50%. So it's still
Yeah.
a huge issue. And one other thing I want to say, as far as legitimacy goes, and in terms of overall agreement, to think about the two, I guess, most polarizing left and right. Not that it's necessarily their fault things are polarized, but justices in recent memory, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the left and Justice Clarence Thomas on the right, even they agreed on decisions 66% of the time. Scalia agreed with Ruth Bader Ginsburg 70% of the time. So the notion that that these justices are just clean votes and that it's always partisan and that even doing this would get you the result that you want, I don't think is really true. But what is true is that the Supreme Court still holds a lot of legitimacy, and this would really jeopardize that.
How did you want to? So I'm just asking Destiny. How did you want like the rest of this to go? Like, is it?
So right now I want to hear you resolve this thing. You guys just talk back and forth. It doesn't have to be super formal, or
Yeah.
you can
Okay.
interrupt each other if you need to. But yeah, so
Sure.
because right now the central point is whether or not the court has been delegitimized. If the court has been sufficiently delegitimized, it seems to logically follow that. Well, then court packet, right? So I think it's important to establish where both of you are at in terms of the legitimacy of the institution of the Supreme Court right now.
Sure. So I guess the basic responses I would give, it seemed like Bastiat kind of raised 2 points. One is that it's not necessarily that the court is partisan, it's that politics is partisan, and therefore it's driving the court to become partisan. And so I don't know that there's actually necessarily a distinction between these positions. If it is the case that politics in general is so partisan that the court also becomes partisan, I don't think it can escape that. Why don't we say just that one at a time so we don't have to do 2 points at once?
Yeah, I don't think at least I wasn't trying to say that the court has become more partisan, because my point in raising the notion of, well, they've had basically 25% of their decisions have been 5-4 and 50% of their decisions have been 9-0 for, say, the last 20 years, is to say that while these votes may be very contentious, their work product is not really changing.
Well,
In
sure.
terms
So
of like the partisan bents.
well, that gets to the second bit. So like I can there's a bunch of neat studies actually showing that like even the Supreme Court generally follows people's opinion. Like that if you look at individual court cases, they do broadly follow with people's political opinion. And so one of the possibilities that you're seeing here is that the Supreme Court is choosing cases that are uncontroversial because it's worried about going too far from public opinion. Even the conservative justices are worried that they legitimize the institution. And so if your argument that it's not delegitimized is that they aren't currently like using their power to delegitimize it, then your argument is basically resting on them continuing to choose to do so. And I don't like to put my faith in people to choose to maintain democracy. I'd like it to be an institutional solution.
Sure, although I don't really know that the Supreme Court is going to go one way or another with respect to quote maintaining democracy. The Supreme Court's chief charge is upholding the Constitution. So I mean,
yeah, but that has enormous impacts for democracy, right? Like they
Yeah, no,
literally
absolutely, but
in
I'm
20
not
what was it like
sure-
2015? They literally had a ruling which was 5-4, only one vote different, where they almost ruled that gerrymandering was unconstitutional. Like that could have enormous impacts. Like gerrymandering is one of the biggest biases in American democracy.
Absolutely, but for example, I guess what I would get at is for all the arguments you could raise of, well, look, it's very important that we have control of the Supreme Court because this issue will come up. For example, voting rights. You could spend your political capital trying to reform the Supreme Court, or you could spend it on a comprehensive voting rights bill. You could, for example, update the.
But what if they strike it down?
The Voting Rights Act. Now, you're right; it's always a risk that they could strike something down. But that's the argument. There is basically like if you're saying, what if they strike it down? Well, I mean, the Supreme Court, I guess, could theoretically strike anything down, but they don't. Well, typically, their decisions are not these kind of.
But typically, the court is also not 6-3 conservatives, right? Like.
Yeah, but even then, it's still the majority of the decisions are not
so far
partisan ties. Now you're right. So far, it is possible things could change.
I think
possible, for example.
I mean, at the beginning,
could destroy the court. But
at the beginning of your speech,
have some precedent before we say that's definitely going to happen, right?
I think something that's really important for a clarifying point for you guys arguing here is, Bastiat, you keep responding with the majority, most of the cases, 50% or whatever, are ruled similarly. But it seems like socialism. What should I call you? Do you want to be called?
You can call me
socialism?
Aiden, SDL. I don't really care.
Aiden. Okay. But so it seems like Aiden's response to this is that like, well, that few percent that you're talking about, those could be the court cases that matter, right?
Sure.
That, yeah, maybe like 95% the judges are in agreement, and then the 5% is like black people are no longer human, or abortion is now illegal, and like, well, now we can talk about how similar they are, but this one thing in difference, right? We have 50% DNA similarity to bananas, so yeah, go into this, yeah.
Okay, so I think that's a legitimate point, but I guess at that point the question is, what do you want to spend or what do you think you can spend your political capital on? Do you want to spend it on a project like reforming the Supreme Court, or rather packing the Supreme Court? Whose history of success?
I don't think political capital is getting into a whole different argument right now. What I want to know is whether or not the court is legitimate. That's what we're not.
Well,
How
look,
should
I
we
mean,
change it? Like,
okay. Well, I'll say this. In terms of its legitimacy, I mean, I think it seems to be compared to the inherently partisan nature of the office of president and the excessively low ratings of public approval of Congress as an institution. The Supreme Court typically does better in public polling than either of those branches of government. So by that metric, they are more legitimate.
On that note, though, one of the things that's very interesting, sorry, just to step in there, like I can literally show you a study that the public approval of the Supreme Court is directly related to how closely it follows like public opinion. And so this argument seems to be like a very contingent one. Yes, right now they're very popular, but what if they start gutting the bills we care about? What if they undo Roe v. Wade? How long is that going to last? I guess Roe v. Wade's actually a bad example because it's not that popular, but like more popular bills.
So I'll say that in response to the let me make a point real quick. In response to what if, that's where I think I'd have to start talking about political capital, because what if calls upon solutions or responses versus just saying, well, let's do something on the basis that they might.
So I guess
so when, in terms of you guys talking about the legitimacy of the Supreme Court and things they could rule in one way or not, I have two questions that I'm going to want to follow down. But the first one, most recently, is so you talk about how they could gut some bill, right? Well, if we believe that Supreme Court nominees come from the president, and if people elected the president, and we'll ignore the Merrick Garland stuff, is it necessarily wrong that the Supreme Court could go partisan in a way such that people voted for a certain president and now he's elected and he makes it partisan? Like, does that not kind of track maybe like what the voting will of the American people was for that?
There's two issues here. So one is that even if a majority, say, were elected and they wanted to just like eliminate a demographic group, I think most of us would agree that it is necessary in a functioning democracy to protect the rights, like certain rights, like voting or like to such a degree that you can't allow the majority to override them. And so I think that there's a somewhat relevant concern in the issues of like gerrymandering and voting rights that the conservative Supreme Court could strike down those rights and meaningfully disenfranchise those minorities from participating in politics. And I had a second point, but I totally forgot it.
Yeah, I would only say that I think it's probably important to try and think about cases that where they have done some of the things that we don't like. For example, the voting rights case, the most recent one, I'll have to pull the name for it, but I think we're both talking about the same case, where the Supreme Court ended the pre-clearance of certain
2013,
six, I think, southern states. Yes, Shelby County is the name of the case. I think maybe, Shelby County. And in that case, the Supreme Court said, look, we are ending pre-clearance here. That part of the Voting Rights Act is unconstitutional. Now, they said, just to be clear, that it was unconstitutional, not because it was inherently something you couldn't do, not because if Congress updated the bill and sent it to them, that they would just strike it down. They said it was unconstitutional because they were restricting states based on data that was in some cases up to 40 years old. Now, that's something that Congress could remedy if it wanted to. And based on what the Supreme Court has said, they wouldn't strike that down. Now, I wish the decision had not gone that way. But it seems to me that the response there, if you've got a majority in Congress, is to pass an updated Voting Rights Act, like, for example, H.R. 1 that addresses some of these and then goes much farther, rather than spending your energy on court packing, right? Like, if that's your worry, is that you're going to get that decision, then I guess pass a law rather than pack a court.
So I guess
just real quick in support of something that Bastiat said. So Dred Scott v. Sanford is one of the most historically horrible rulings that have ever come out of the Supreme Court. So in 1857, the Supreme Court basically said, oh, the Constitution doesn't apply to black people. And then they made that ruling. And then in response to that ruling, the 13th and 14th Amendment were passed, which nullified those rulings essentially by changing the Constitution, as an example of what Bastiat is talking about. Yeah.
So I guess the 2 points there are I do agree that the court struck down. Sorry, let me do the three things. The second point that I wanted to bring up before was just if we are agreeing that the in a partisan fashion where they are working with the president to provide a second answer to your question, Destiny, then I think we'd also have to abandon the idea that the court is like a nonpartisan institution. And so I think that if that were true, then the legitimacy of the court as this like neutral arbiter would also be falling apart. To respond to the Constitution changing thing, I think that it's valid to say that yes, the Constitution. Again, there's actually another neat study that the court is less likely to strike down federal laws the more laws that Congress passes that threaten to restrict the rights of the Supreme Court. And so there is a truth to the fact that the court will restrain itself to make sure that it doesn't go too far out of public opinion, because as Ginsburg said, it doesn't have the sword. But the concern is that basically they will go as far as they can. So unlike the voting rights ruling, it's possible that they did the ruling on technicality. Basically, they ruled against it by in 2013, Shelby County, they ruled against it on this technicality, more or less, that the data is too old, because that way they didn't have to argue the much more difficult political position of like, oh, we don't actually think that there's a right for all people to have equal voting participation or like equal polling stations or whatever. And similarly, the concern is that in particular, if we see that Republicans are in fear that they have like a long-term ability to maintain power, that these court justices might feel pressured by that to act in such a way that they would maintain power, if we are to believe that they are partisan justices. Like this is their last best shot.
Well, I guess there are two things there. One, it sounds like you're saying that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, you're saying that
Sure.
the real goal of the justices was to undermine the entire thing, and they picked this technicality, but their real motive was to undermine the entire thing.
I can't say, but that's certainly possible, I guess is my point.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And I guess I would say you're right that that's possible, but not
Sure,
only
sure.
do we not
I understand that's a little bit
know that,
conspiratorial, so
but
like I won't
beyond
argue it
that,
too hard.
I
But
think you're sort of, I guess, making a point that perhaps goes to the heart of this, which is that it's just not possible, for example, to rule
Sure.
on a technicality in any way that is legitimate, right? Like you can't, for example, like if, and maybe this is your position, if I strike down a part of the Voting Rights Act because I say, look, I like this, but it's just not constitutional. The way they're doing it's not constitutional. So even though this leads to a result I don't like, I have to rule this way because the Constitution is such that, as Justice Scalia used to say, garbage in, garbage out. You give me a bad law, I have to rule in that way, even if I don't like it, right? So I guess it seems like your position is that if you rule in that way, and again, I'm not trying to paint bad faith, but the argument you just made sounded like that to me. You're saying if you rule on a technicality in a way that leads to a bad outcome, that's illegitimate because it's led to a bad outcome.
So the argument is not that there shouldn't be rulings on technicalities. The argument is that it's certainly possible that you could see like cloaking or whatever. That's basically the argument. And so I don't want to argue that too strongly because that's more or less be arguing for conspiracy on like the Supreme Court to hide their position. I don't have like strong evidence that the 2013 Voting Rights Act was a conspiracy.
Yeah. I don't, and I'm not trying to accuse you of a conspiracy. I guess all I'm trying to say is that I think it is possible. And I think, for example, some of the interesting jurisprudence during the actual New Deal era where this came up last time, it is possible for a statute to be, drafted in such a way, or a law to be drafted in such a way that it doesn't pass court review. Then Congress fixes it, and then it passes review from the same court.
So
as
I know
opposed to a court being an agency that is just determined to destroy or determined to achieve political goals.
So one
also,
of the
just in this too, real quick, I think that like generally, my understanding is that the Supreme Court generally favors narrow rulings versus very broad ones as well. So a lot of people were upset in 2018 for the ruling of the Masterpiece Cake Shop v. Colorado Civil Rights Commission, where the court made a very narrow ruling against that, saying that like, well, it seems like you guys like brought his religion up way too much when you were talking about this, rather than making a broader ruling on like should this type of discrimination be allowed. I would agree with Bastiat here, and that I think it's a bit much to imply that there is some conspiratorial nature to Supreme Court rulings, especially given the fact that Supreme Court justices serve life sentences and they're impeachable or not impeachable, and they're like, there's no like threat that they have for political stuff. I think that's a fair point.
I did want to say one difference between now and like the FDR era is just the gridlock that we see in Congress. So when the Supreme Court strikes down a law, there is unfortunately, so I don't think this is the Supreme Court's fault per se, but there is a much lower likelihood that Congress is going to pass this new law that fixes the issues just because so few things get through Congress. Now that could be resolved, like HR 1, maybe it'll pass. But I don't, again, that's not entirely the Supreme Court's fault. So
No, I get what you're saying. It's just, at a certain point, I would say, for example, if our problem is the Democrats can't get past gerrymandering, it seems like the response should be to do something about gerrymandering rather than to do something, one, I guess, about the Supreme Court and then hope it takes. Because the other side of it is that while, I mentioned, for example, the kind of the wild card rulings of some of these justices in the past. So just a few that I could think of. I mean, once these people are on the court for life, I mean, there's no, for example, if some of these, future appointees decide to vote in such a way that we don't like, there's no check on that. I mean, it's, we're unlike, for example, passing a bill on gerrymandering, where, the worst you have is like, something is going to be done, right? And your risk is that the Supreme Court might strike it down. If your only response to dealing with that stuff is to reform the Supreme Court, I mean, you really, you're riding on, I guess, future cases happening, maybe getting to the Supreme Court accepting them, something happening as a result of their decision, them not ruling on a narrow basis. I mean, I know that that's not the only thing we have to do, or that's not the only thing we can do. We can do the Supreme Court and we can pass laws, but I'm skeptical
I guess
of that, given the way that court packing has, given the way it went down last time around.
So you can clarify if I'm getting this wrong, but I feel like there's a little bit of a at some level you seem to be presenting 2 points which I think are somewhat contradictory. At the one hand, you seem to be suggesting that the Supreme Court would be unwilling to do these like major legislative changes, like doing something like striking down the Voting Rights Act in a conservative direction, even though it has like a significant conservative majority, which would seem to indicate that like it's not going to do major. But then simultaneously, you also seem to be very concerned that the legitimacy of the Supreme Court is lost. If it's true that the Supreme Court isn't going to do major legislation, why wouldn't it matter if the legitimacy, like what is the importance of that legitimacy if it's not doing anything important?
Well,
I don't think you can maintain both.
Well, let's see. I guess I'm not sure that I'm not saying they won't do anything important. I guess,
Sure.
And in fact, it actually kind of sounded like you were saying that they will try to track public opinion. And really the only thing that's changed is now that it's 6-3 instead of 5-4, it sounds like your argument is basically they're just going to throw that out. Right.
Well, that's the question. It's that let's say that so Republicans are currently doing a whole bunch of stuff which enables them to lead in a minority, right? Like the effect of gerrymandering is Democrats would need to win on average 54.4% of the vote to get a majority in the House. They'd need to win some absurd amount to get the Senate. The president, I think, has a similar, like they need to win like 56%. So there's all of these minority biases. The Republicans didn't set up all of those. They definitely set up gerrymandering. And they're the gerrymandering in some states is so bad that they're ruling in minority. So I think that before the stream, well, I guess I don't want to bring up like off the record comments or whatever too much. Before the stream, we were talking about how like the to some degree they seem to be ruling as if they were concerned that this is their last best hurrah. And so if it's true that the court rides a public opinion, then that might be true in general. But there might be something specific about this case that because they have not embraced like immigration reform, they haven't embraced like the new party, as it were, are worried that this is their last best chance for like 20, 40 years.
Right. Just to be clear, when I was talking about earlier before we started the debate, saying that basically the Republican Party is thinking perhaps, Trump is their last chance, it's their last best hurrah for all the things they want to do. I don't think the Supreme Court is part of that. Like, I know there are attempts to get people on the Supreme Court as part of that, but I don't think like John Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts is, or for that matter, really, I don't know, maybe I can't ascribe motive to the justices, but I am suspicious that they are thinking about their institution in that fashion too.
That's possible.
Could I ask something like a second point related to this? Are partisan nominations necessarily delegitimizing of the court? So, for instance, if I were to look at, say, one key issue, say abortion, let's say that we could divine the opinions of Supreme Court justices before they become Supreme Court justices, right? The nominees. If we could know how somebody would vote in, I think it's like Casey v. Anthony or any Roe v. Wade, or is it Casey Anthony? But if we could know how
Casey.
Yeah, Planned Parenthood v. Casey. If we could know how they could vote beforehand, would we ever expect a Democrat president to nominate an anti-abortion judge? Or would we ever expect a Republican to nominate a pro-abortion judge? And is this a bad thing if people nominate judges that are more in line with their political views? Does that necessarily undermine the institution of the court by making picks that you think are more likely to agree with your overall ideology?
Do you want to go first or I?
Sure. I don't think it's. I guess when you. I guess I don't. It's hard to imagine it working any other way. Like if somebody has the ability to pick, right, an important position, then naturally, especially on real hot button issues that your constituents, no matter what your background is, care about, like
Hmm.
abortion. I mean, there's no, you have to. I can't imagine saying, "Well, I would not consider that," and I don't. I just don't really think that's even possible. I don't, and so I guess I don't know that I can think of an argument for why it's bad. It's only bad to me, I guess, if we're in a situation where we are not even concerned about the qualifications of the justices at all, and it's literally just political views. But I mean, the bench of federal justices is pretty deep, and I mean, there's not really a shortage of qualified people to
So
be on the Supreme Court. So
I would just note that it's not a binary where it's either the only thing you care about is politics and you don't care about qualifications. I think there's a gradient. And the argument that I was raising as to why we've seen this rise in partisan judges is we've been slowly moving down that gradient. So like in the 90s, there was a much greater preference over qualifications. People weren't as concerned about the partisan lean of the justices, and they increasingly are. So it seems that as we move down that gradient, you're going to get closer and closer, not as like it's not going to be a sudden step. This is like a slow decline of democratic norms that we're seeing as we move towards that political model. What was I was going to mention like that by some metrics of like how conservative the Supreme Court is. There are two main scores. One of the two scorers estimates that if ACB was added, it would be the most conservative court we've had since 1950. So it'd be a big shift to the right if they actually ruled that way. And so I do think that like it's hard to look at the situation and say this wasn't just for partisan gain because it's all just about qualifications when it's like such a significant shift.
Yeah, I agree that it's like I can't think of a situation where I would say it's only like it's not partisan. I can't really think of. I'm I think the only reason I can imagine why in the past it wasn't partisan is because
Mm-hmm.
people weren't really like the public wasn't paying so much attention to it. And in a situation like that, then I guess Congress is not so interested. But now that the Supreme Court is a serious issue of public debate and citizens are really engaged on it too, as opposed to the past where I suppose it was less so. One thing I'd be curious though that I haven't looked up is
Mm-hmm.
the last period I can think of with a lot of like political polarization.
Mm-hmm.
I guess like comparable to what we've got now, the 1960s and 70s. I
Mm-hmm.
would be curious what Supreme Court appointments and votes looked like then as well, because we had a court then that was super, and haven't looked at this, so I'm curious. Maybe you two have.
I don't have those
We
stats.
had a
The stuff I
Supreme
have
Court
goes
that
back
was,
to the 70s.
yeah, the Supreme Court was a very, like at that point was very, you could call it reasonably activist, and it did things that were very controversial with a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I would agree
Yeah,
with
the
most
Warren
of what
Court, right?
right.
Something to keep in mind too, just as we're talking about like political biases and nominations or whatever. You can probably go farther back, but under Nixon, Nixon nominated Clement Haynsworth, and that nomination was rejected by the Senate, 45-55, because of his record on like civil rights.
Hmm.
That was like kind of a political rejection. And then there were also ethical lives that were brought up as well. But the civil rights thing, I think, was the main thing over there. And then under Ronald Reagan, he nominated Robert Bork, and Bork was rejected as well. I think because people were upset at his opinions. It was like 42-58. People were upset about his opinions related to constitutional issues from Nixon's Saturday Night Massacre.
Yeah,
So there have been rejections of Supreme Court justices in the past that have been voted on because of what seems to be like pretty politically partisan issues. That's only going back 50, 60 years. I don't know how much further go back. You can probably find
So
more.
I guess I posted this graph from 538, which I think captures it reasonably well. While it looks like in the period from like the 70s to the 90s is what I'm saying, there were some justices who were voted down and were controversial. Most of the justices had these all near unanimous decisions, right? To extend Bastiat's logic, right? Oh, there were some exceptions, but the majority of justices were almost unanimous. The Senate was almost entirely, it seems, concerned about qualifications. And then you start hitting this like post 1994 era where you start getting 78-22, 58-42, 68-31, down and down the line until where every single one we've had of the past 7 is a highly partisan vote. And so I think that while there are examples in the past, the overall trend is like there was a sharp increase in partisanship since the 90s.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess I don't view that as an issue. I guess like I view that as an issue, and I like I like some of the ideas for Supreme Court reform that would deal with that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't view that as an issue that I would be willing to then expand the Supreme Court for, and then take basically an issue of like accusations of partisanship, and then just like dial it up to 11 by making it very plain that the purpose of this reform to the Supreme Court is to make it more partisan.
So I guess what I would ask is, hasn't that already been made clear in like the Garland holdup, in the various partisan votes, and in like the ACB appointment? It's all been clear that it's purely partisan. What additional delegitimization is there to like being more partisan about this?
Right, and I think that they have changed. Congress has changed the way that Congress has adjusted its norms, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it has not adjusted the rules of the institution and how the institution itself works. And I think that's a step beyond.
Well, but they aren't even changing the rules of the institution, right? They're just adding another seat
like
to
the
it, set of
Democrats,
seats.
for example, could have done, like, they could have held up, I guess, nominations in the past. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
the reason we're here seems to be because of the luck of the draw, right? Of Republicans just getting lucky with Supreme Court picks compared to the Democrats. But I mean, it's.
I will correct, not pure luck of the draw. Luck of the draw would have given Trump 2 Supreme Court picks. He got 3 because of deliberate obstructive action from the Republican Senate, just to be super clear on that.
Okay,
right?
well, that's
Garland
a fair
was
point.
blocked by a disruption of norms in the Senate. Yeah.
That's a fair point. Although, maybe I shouldn't be talking about luck of the draw at all, because you could just as easily argue that the Democrats wouldn't have had these problems if they had just won elections. So, I mean, my problem with the Supreme Court right now is that it operates as a kind of death lottery.
So I guess
the end result is that now every time there's a seat, it is a partisan disaster. But it seems like your position is to then basically bring the partisanship into the open, dial it up, as opposed to, I guess, trying to do something else to it. Or I guess I would view your solution as making that problem worse, not benefiting it, in exchange for policy outcomes that are possible but speculative at best, and which I think would come at the cost of really, I think, dealing with the fundamental reason why our democracy is in trouble, which is that Congress has routinely delegated things to the president and to the courts. For example, we still have no codification, for example, of Roe v. Wade, right? It's not in federal law except through the extent that it's gone to the Supreme Court. We've had Democratic Congresses, we've had Democratic presidents, but they have refused to act on this. And so I think that, to me, is the real failure, not the construction of the court.
Well, so on that, like the two problems I have here is, I would like to design, the Supreme Court feels like it's designed for like a clubby sort of politics where there is no partisanship. If partisanship, when introduced to an institution, can so quickly like destroy it and make it as partisan as I think it is in the modern era, then I think we should change that institution. Like, this is the same argument actually for reform of Congress. This is why I don't think that first past the post works for Congress. Like, the very fact that you noted that Congress hasn't done these things is why we got to change Congress. I think the same argument applies, that it seems like the Supreme Court is non-functional. It seems like it's based on lottery. It's based on death. It's highly partisan nowadays. Therefore, it needs reform. And I did want to say, like, as a second note, I do somewhat like the reforms that what's the guy's name? I read the article that the reforms you seem to like on Twitter.
The Yale Law School study, which we can, again, I want to like plunge into that because that risks going after what Destiny was saying, which is don't agree on something.
Yeah, and apparently he's gonna, so I don't want to. He's pretty scary. I don't want to risk that.
But yeah, I mean, so
I do have some. No. I just want to say one last point. So on that, the question is, let's say we have a reform. Doesn't matter what the reform is. How do we get from now, no reform, to the reform? What do we lever over the Republicans to change the structure of the Supreme Court? What makes them give?
Yeah. Well, I will say, I guess that it's in terms of like reform of the Supreme Court. If the Democrats have control over the presidency and Congress, then I suppose they don't really have to give anything. They could just think, the question is, like, if there were a way to do a reform, and the reason I like the Yale Law School reform that I proposed is that there's no ratcheting up, right? After you expand the court in the way in that article, there's no tit for tat there. That's a one and done. But in if you could, I guess, expand the court in such a way that there would be no tit for tat, it would be a more palatable option. I still wouldn't be in favor of it, but it would be.
Actually, on that note, why don't I just expand on that before we get too deep into it? The argument is that we're in a prisoner's dilemma, and that right now both parties have an incentive to escalate. The Republican Party has an incentive to hold up Democratic judges. They have an incentive to hold up Democratic Supreme Court nominees, and they're going to do it as much as they can. The Dems have the same incentive. So the question is, how do you change those incentives? The suggestion of another scholar, who I can link the article of, is that the way we do it is this sort of game theoretic thing where bill that would give us 4 new seats on the Supreme Court, something along those lines. We instantly fill 2, so we're back to where we were before. So Republicans are already mad. They're already, but then to fill the we pass the law such that we will fill the remaining 2 unless a reform to Congress is passed. The basic idea there is that then their incentives will be aligned in doing the reform. Because I think my concern is that if you're saying you're going to do like the lottery system or the 555 system, which are relatively complicated and require like to keep working with it, as you said, if the only thing that is required to change it is Congress, then as soon as Congress changes, you might have them change it back. I'm concerned that you need like stronger reforms that are less undoable. You need something like an amendment. And so how do we get to that is my question.
Well, I will say that the reason, well, I don't want to go into the Supreme Court lottery just yet. I don't want to like
sure
sort of change the subject here, but I guess the reason I like that is there isn't really a way for Congress to change that one back that I have been able to find. But that
couldn't
being
they
said,
just undo the law? What?
Just
say take HR 2020, strike it,
okay,
Done.
I'll tell you. All right, I'll talk about it. So here's the big idea.
In terms of what socialism, in terms of what you're suggesting, so I imagine that when you say they should pass some law with the other 2 seats up for hostage, basically, to pass some law to make the picks less partisan, like how?
Yeah.
Like what kind of law are you talking about?
It's so you pass a law which gives you leverage. The leverage can be for whatever goal. It's so say we have kind of 3 reforms. I have a reform that I haven't explained, and then Bastiat has suggested 2 reforms, which are the Supreme Court lottery and the 555 court. Any of these reforms, we like plug it into the law, and we say unless we pass a law that looks like this, unless we pass this as like an amendment or something, then we're going to add 2 more seats, and now it's not going to be 6 conservative, 5 liberal. It's going to be 7 liberal, 6 conservative.
Yeah, and what I looked over that plan. I guess what I didn't like was it seems like it based again on the last example we have, of how Supreme Court reform, court packing worked in the past during the Roosevelt administration, in a time in which, I guess the background to that concerns me about any kind of political prospect for Supreme Court reform is this. In the 1936 election, FDR wins with 60% of the popular vote and 98% of the electoral vote. It is an insane blowout. He controls Congress with 77% of the Senate and 77% of the House. Unprecedented in terms of political strength. The first major domestic policy initiative he undertakes is the court packing. It exposes faults in the Democratic Party, faults which still exist today, albeit in different forms. And immediately the public is against it. So, and it's very telling given how successful he was with the public in getting elected and getting his people in Congress. In the 1938 elections, let me see, I wrote this down. The Democrats lost a total of, the Democrats lost 8 seats in the Senate and 72 seats in the House. And from that point on, they still had majority as a party, but the breakdown in the factions of the Democratic Party hamstrung Roosevelt's agenda for the next for the rest of his term there. So what I'm concerned about is that what we're talking about is taking a political calculus that didn't work in an era where the Democrats had a supermajority, and then applying it to what we hope and still hope will be a reasonable majority. It won't be a supermajority, after if Biden is elected and the Democrats take the Senate. We're going to apply that in a much more vulnerable political situation, and like Roosevelt, lose all of the steam that comes through a big contentious reform. So I think that the idea that we're going to pass this one is speculative, but even if we do, the notion that it's going to result in the Republicans coming to the table, as opposed to using this as red meat to wave to their base to score a blowout in 2 years, I'm very skeptical of that. I mean, I haven't seen anything that suggests that that's how it would work because, again, historically, what happened was the Republicans came back from the dead as a result of court packing.
Okay, so just to be clear, so now we're kind of moving on to like the political efficacy. I don't feel like 100% we established whether or not the court was legitimate or is not or is or isn't legitimate. I feel like there are decent answers on both sides.
It's probably not something that you can prove objectively, Destiny.
Yeah,
like if you're going to do down your logic tree, I think that's one of those ones where you're going to have to call that one gray, right?
Yeah, especially because it seems that we don't necessarily even agree on what does it mean for the court to be legitimate. So I'm okay moving past that. I just wanted to establish that.
Yeah, talking about that some more or not?
No, that's fine. We can pass that. I was just curious if there was like a razor, like boom, the court is completely illegitimate because of this. But we can go
Well,
back and
I
forth
do
on that
want to say
forever.
one more thing about it, I guess, about
Uh-oh.
legitimacy, and the
All
reason
right.
why it's worth talking about, and maybe you'll have a thought
Okay.
on this.
All
The
right.
reason
One
it's
final
worth
one.
thinking about is that, again, like Justice Kagan said in a little bit I mentioned earlier, the legitimacy is all the court has. If the
Ginsburg,
president
right?
has no legitimacy,
Oh, sorry, I
he
shouldn't
can.
call you out on that.
What's that?
I said Ginsburg, but I shouldn't have called you out. That's like a technicality. I'm sorry.
Oh, well, no, I'm sorry. I didn't cite Kagan, but the
Oh, she said the
second
same
part I
thing.
mentioned, yeah, she
Oh,
mentioned a
okay.
bit about we have no army, we have no money. But yeah, you're right. The other part was from Ginsburg. But what she meant when she said that is, if we don't like Trump, he's not legitimate. Well, he's got guns.
Mhm.
Congress has money, and money, can compel people to do things. The court really only has legitimacy. So I think it's a
Mhm.
little different than talking about a president or a Congress, because what I fear is a situation where you've got your next Trump and you've got a delegitimized court that the president just says, screw you. What are you going to do about it? Me and my supporters don't care and are going, whereas the president, for all his faults, and they are legion, has been somewhat constrained by the Supreme Court when it has issued decisions that have gone against him. So that's my worry.
Sure.
Okay. Do we want to move on? Okay. So then, like, the political efficacy of doing this. Is it possible to do it? And if the Democrats were to do it, would they suffer severe political consequences for doing so? And then again, I understand this is a bit of I don't know, just like an ethereal topic. It's going to be really hard to definitively say yes or no, but yeah, go. Bastiat kind of already opened with
Yeah, I
argument.
would
Sure.
only say that
So,
I'm open to
sorry.
the alternative, but that's my best reading of history and where we're at now.
So I guess I would have two main points here. One is that there is a key distinction between the kind of so the suggestion I'm making is not just pack the courts for partisan gain, because I think that will look bad. It might lead Republicans to do better. This is unlike the Roosevelt, right? Roosevelt was just packing for partisan gain to pass the New Deal legislation. And to be clear, in the end, he did end up the court did end up working with him. The long history is that whenever the court does get seriously threatened, they worry more about their legitimacy than striking down policies. Stopped rejecting his policies. So, as an aside, that is a fear of mine, that you get a president who comes in, bullies them, and makes them do whatever they want. But the second comparison I would make is the difference is that we are passing something where we are trying to reform the institution to become less partisan. So we are saying we explicitly do something like we are playing partisan hardball to reduce partisan hardballness or something. I don't know how much that will matter in like the messaging or whatever, but I will say that's like a genuine structural difference, even if it's not a messaging difference. The second point I was just going to make is there's a direct analogy to the impeachment. So I will post some polls about the impeachment in the group chat or whatever. So
Okay.
these are polls on the impeachment over time. And these are polls for court packing. And so what you saw in impeachment is before Nancy Pelosi announced the inquiry, 51% opposed it, 38% supported it. That's a net minus 13. After she announced it, it was 43%, 49% support. So plus 6. What does that mean? Just to boil it down, plus 19% support after Nancy Pelosi says aye. Most of that is because the Democrats fall in line. Right now, we have almost identical negative numbers for support for court packing. Right now, court packing, 47% against, 34% support. 13. If we imagine it's just as easy to flick a switch and Democrats change their mind, it's not that hard to imagine that we might have net popular support for this. So the concern is that right now, after these impeachment inquiries, which so many Democrats were worried would energize the Trump base, it doesn't seem like that has done so. Trump is on, those are correct. He's on record to lose like a landslide victory. This could be different, but the impeachment is not like, it is a counter example, I would say.
Okay. So I'm not sure how I would read the impeachment on this, because
Sure.
I guess I would be curious, like whether the impeachment would have landed differently if we hadn't had, for example, COVID-19. That really
Sure.
kind of changed the narrative. It's sort of like this is actually the first time because I read the story not the story, the article that you cited, and I saw they mentioned the impeachment, and I was just thinking, wow, that happened, didn't it?
Yeah.
But it
It feels so long ago, doesn't it?
yeah. But
Real quick on this, also, just because I don't know if I should call it like a non sequitur or not, but when you say that Pelosi announced the impeachment inquiry, and then you imply that if we were to announce the same for court packing, you're essentially saying that public support changed in response to Pelosi's announcement, but it could also be that the public support changed in response to the findings of the inquiry. which
The reason I say that in particular, if you look at the 538 graph, it has a whole bunch of these vertical lines at points where like key events in the impeachment were happening. So you see, I don't know, like what's that, late April, Mueller made their report public. Late July, Mueller testified before Congress. None of that moved these popular opinions. It was like more or less flat 50% opposed, flat 43% support until like instantaneously Pelosi announced the impeachment inquiry. And so I guess I don't have a more general model for this, but I think I want to like appeal to some people that I've read that politicians can significantly impact political views. Like I want to say there's some examples with like Republicans very rapidly shifting their policy positions now that Trump is in power, but I can't think of those offhand. So
I can think of one, like their position on free trade, for example.
True.
The Republican Party used to be the party of free trade, and now it is the party of protectionism, and only really one factor has changed.
Yep.
So yeah, I mean that's certainly a factor. At the same time, I guess I don't know.
It is limited. I will say this is, we're talking about a small change, mostly in the Democratic Party. It might not work for independents or something. So that to limit myself.
Yeah, like that was one thing, I guess. Like it would be seen, like even if the numbers moved considerably on Democrats, whether they would move for anybody else, I think is questionable. And the thing that was interesting about the let me see, I think this was it, the Washington Examiner YouGov poll that you are referencing here. Sure. The 60% of Democrats were themselves split between Democrats who want a majority and who want to just kind of restore some kind of neutral basis or neutral split.
Though, to be clear, though, that the majority don't just want 2 courts, they want 4, right? 4 would be a liberal majority. So they're split. Right. The Democrats are 30% in favor of, they want new justices, and 30% wants 2 new justices. I am a moderate, right? Socialism done left here, advocating for moderacy, only 2 justices, unless the Republicans bend the knee.
Well, I think what any proposal that I think requires the Republicans to do something or it would get worse, I would be concerned would backfire and be used by them as a tool for just like more fundraising, more campaigning, more success. Because I think the Republicans would have a pretty easy time making this into a relatively unpopular issue. I mean, not only the history of court packing suggests that they would have a lot of, in the United States suggests that they would have some success there. Again, at the federal level, Republicans have done this in Arizona at the state level.
Sure.
But I would argue that, the federal Supreme Court feels more like it's for keeps. I think it would be, I don't know, it seems to me like they might even view it as a kind of a gift if it is something that, I think under the plan here, it is that it only takes effect after the next election.
Are you asking about this reform?
Yeah. The reform you're proposing is just 2 immediately and then 2 more down the line, unless you work with us to get something better.
My suggestion would be just like, so my suggestion is do 2 now, right? So that you can pass laws and they don't get immediately struck down, something along those lines. And then just because I think that I think that they have already delegitimized it. That's like the previous argument we were having. So to put that one on the side, 2 immediately. And then the suggestion is do 2 say 2021, while you are certain the Democrats still control the Senate. So it's a credible threat, but it's also a reversible threat. You can undo it if there's a change. And I agree that there's problems in this, but the question is basically like, if you want to reform the Supreme Court, how do we actually do it, right? What is the best way to use our political capital to get that reform?
Yeah, and I think to me...
Also, can I get some water real quick? I'm going to listen, but can I get some water?
Okay, sure, yeah. As long as you can still hear and I can talk. Yeah. I think to me, the worry is that that would be, basically that's a one and done. That's a super controversial reform that will require whipping the Democrats into shape to get them all behind it, because of course the majority... if the Senate majority happens, it's going to be in the 50s, right? It's not going to be a super majority, right? So they're going to need to get Democrats on the same team. I know there will be some Democratic opposition to this because not all Democrats back the idea. Moderate Democrats, for example, in swing districts may very well come out against it, as happened, for example, in FDR's time when some Democrats came out against it. So my concern is that even if this happens, it will end up being the one big achievement of a Biden administration. And so there won't be any progress on voting rights. There won't be any passage of HR 1. There won't be any healthcare reform. There won't be any climate bill. There won't be, I guess hopefully stimulus relief would happen before this, in any event.
So this seems like
that's what I think would happen. I think it would do kind of like Obamacare did, where it would suck the air out of the room and cripple the administration.
Well,
as a
that's
result
kind of
a
the
bloody
argument
fight.
then. So if something is politically controversial, should we do something like where we take the laws Democrats want to pass and we fold them up such that the most popular is like the first one we do? It doesn't impact political capital whatsoever, or maybe it boosts it, and then we work our way down. Now we've got the least popular one, and we do it like near the end or something along the whatever the end means. Like to me, this sounds like just a Democrats have some policy positions which are unpopular, I'm sure. So should in general they just do unpopular. I guess the second question I would raise, and again, these are all very hypothetical. I don't know that we can prove any of these. Republicans have stumped for a long time that we need to elect Republicans to get them on the Supreme Court. It's like part of their project. They've got the Federalist Project. Trump talked about it a ton. There's a lot of evidence that people voted for him in like 2016 because of the Supreme Court. Like evangelicals basically pinched their nose and they're like, we got to vote for this guy. Got to get rid of abortion. Could you argue a similar sort of thing could happen for Democrats? In other words, let's say it drives up engagement for Republicans, and let's say it drives it up quite a bit, like 15%, but we get a similar effect among Democrats, plus 10 or something. It's still a partisan gain for them. Maybe they still benefit, but there's like some sort of trade-off.
It's I guess that's possible, but I'm glad you mentioned that because as far as I've ever seen, that is an issue that just animates Republicans more.
Do you think along with real quick with what Bastiat is saying? So in 1994, as part of the crime bill, we got that assault weapons ban, and I've heard it said, I'm not as completely political familiar, but I've heard it said that that assault weapons ban, part of that crime bill, was so much political capital by the Democrats that they lost the House for like 12 years after that because of that assault weapons ban. And then similarly, after the ACA with Obama, so much political capital was spent on that 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 Congress immediately flipped, and then he lost Congress for the 6 years in the later part of his presidency, the half of his first term and then the second term. So what I think there is something true to what Bastiat is saying, and that if you expend a lot of political capital on an issue like this will be the one thing that you do, or it could be the one thing that you do. Not necessarily, but.
So the concerns I would raise are, let's say that it is genuinely the Democrats do. The question then becomes, what things might spend their political capital on? What you should be doing theoretically is like weighing bills by impact versus capital spent. Like what's the return on capital, the return on political. And I think that probably there's a whole bunch of reforms like HR1 that would be passed, that should be passed before this. So if this were the first bill Democrats, absolutely, it'd be a terrible. Let's say it's like the 20th. We can probably fit in a lot of the important stuff in there. And now it's like 2021, we passed this bill and we threatened them, I don't know, halfway through 2021, we're going to appoint 6 more unless you do the reform. This argument doesn't seem to hold as strongly to me if you front-load a bunch of popular stuff. If they're smart, yes.
Yeah, I think you're right that if you do it later on after you've done all the bigger stuff, then it would be less of an issue than it would be if you started your term in office with it like Roosevelt did when he started his second term by doing this.
Yeah.
I would agree that would be a better time to do it. I still think, though, it would be more animating for Republicans. Also, the way that it's framed, for example, where it would be framed as I think the article uses the term constitutional hardball.
Yes.
I feel like that again. This is more speculative, but I am very skeptical that is going to animate Republicans or animate Democrats.
What I wanted to ask you about that is, do you think that Republicans have historically been more animated about this because of Roe v. Wade and other controversial decisions that are like part of their ideology, part of like what motivates them? But now that Democrats have like they have ACB, they have Kavanaugh to point to, these things have been like part of their public consciousness, and it's been so partisan. Do you think that effect will be different than it has been before? To be fair, I can't really ask you to answer this, but
sure. Well, like, are you asking basically, is something going to change now that they've got their 6 people?
Yes. In other words,
right? Like, if it can happen, if you can get rid of Roe v. Wade ever, these people are going to do it. And if they can't, what is even the point? You have clearly failed, right?
I want to ask a question.
Good point.
I want to ask an inverse question for both of you. For socialism done left, my question is going to be, if KCV, Planned Parenthood, or Roe v. Wade comes before the court, and they basically reaffirm the ruling 5-4, they manage to keep that intact, would that change your opinion significantly on anything you're saying? Would you look at it as like, well, maybe there is more integrity to the court that I'm giving props to? And then for Bastiat, if we were to start to get a ton of 6-3 or 5-4 rulings against what we would consider maybe some like fundamental civil rights related stuff. And if these were broad rulings too, that like, yeah, gerrymandering is fine, get rid of all this voter clearance stuff, like blah blah blah, would that change your opinion on the integrity of the court, and then like the necessity to change the institution in some dramatic way? Socialism and left, you can go first, guys.
Sure. So I guess my argument about the problems with the institution mostly stem from the way that it's structured. And so I've raised. I can send you some neat demonstrating that, again, a lot of the time the Supreme Court will concede to public opinion because they are worried about that legitimacy. Even if it's conservatives who want to slowly push back on public policy, they got to do so in a way that doesn't violate public opinion so much that now the president will just be like, nope, we're just going to ignore your positions, that the Congress will just ignore your positions. So I do think that it would preserve the legitimacy of the court. However, it wouldn't solve the structural problems in the court. And so even if the court remains legitimate, it would still remain flawed and in such a way that we should use the court packing to reform the court.
And when you say, real quick, when you say structural problems, specifically, what are you referring to here?
It's that you have partisan, it's winner takes all. Whoever's control of the Senate and the president, they get the pick.
Okay, and gotcha. So I know that we're not specifically talking about this, and I don't want to wheel this in, or maybe we can do this at the end. But so real quick, some people have proposed that every 16 years, I think, we do a new judge like that. Would something like that restore? So that would mean that one pick per president. Would something like that restore the legitimacy in your eyes, or would that not be enough?
Two things. So I've suggested. I don't want to take too much of Bastiat's time before he forgets the question.
Go ahead.
The basic take that I want is term limited and ranked choice justices. And I think that if you don't have the ranked choice, or in general some way to pick a centrist justice, it is going to be very hard to restore the structural integrity of the court, is I guess my concern. I think that you will have increasingly partisan Supreme and lower courts without some sort of ranked choice or moderating picking method.
Okay, gotcha. Okay,
before I answer that, what is the ranked choice that you're talking about here?
Sure. So the way that a ranked choice vote would work is you've got five. Let's say you've got 5 candidates for one position. Just make it very simple. Right. You rank them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yeah. If candidate 1 doesn't pass, your vote goes to candidate 2. If 2 doesn't pass, it goes to 3. And now candidate 3 passes. What it tends to encourage the middle win. You could even set it something absurd, they have to win 75% of the ballot, and then it'll tend to pick the center.
Clear. You're talking about ranked choice voting for candidates, not like some elections for judges, right?
Oh, no. Yeah, I mean, more radically, I would propose that. But in the current context, for the Supreme Court, in 2020, we should just have the Senate do a ranked choice vote.
So the president would essentially nominate 10 justices or something, and then there'd be a ranked choice vote in the Senate?
That would be the proposal, yeah. A slate of justices, and ideally, I would actually like it to be multi-member. So it'd be you elect, say, 5 or 3 at a time, because that even more encourages you're going to get one lib, one conservative, and also a moderate. Whereas if you pick ranked choice vote, can still result if everyone votes very dedicatedly, where you put one lib and one conservative. All the conservatives pick the conservative, all the libs pick the lib. You can sort of still end up in this. It's more safe to have a multiple-member ranked choice vote, but I would even be happy with just ranked choice vote.
Yeah, I haven't thought about a ranked choice vote for justices before, but so I'd have to think about that some more. But
sure,
what I guess to your question, Destiny, but thanks for explaining that to me. Your question, Destiny, of would I, if we started getting these rulings that I'm saying are less likely, but are possible, if we get somebody who strikes down the whole Voting Rights Act, just on technicality because it's just a racist decision or something really ridiculous. Or really against the grain of public opinion. Would I be more strongly in favor of it? I would say this. I would not be in favor of just the position of adding more justices to the Supreme Court in that situation. What I would be in favor of, and what I am in favor of now, is the idea of the Supreme Court lottery proposal that we have talked about, that we have hinted about basically here. And let me just explain that real quick to explain what my proposal for reforming is. So I acknowledge the partisan nature of Supreme Court appointments. I don't like it. I also don't like the risk of partisan supermajorities on the court like we're looking at now. And so what I would do in my ideal situation is a situation where what I would do is what Yale Law School has proposed in their law journal called basically called the Supreme Court lottery. And the idea is, and Bernie Sanders has talked about this in a positive sense too, so this isn't some secret neolib plot. The idea is...
go ahead.
Yeah. The idea is that everybody who's on the Federal Court of Appeals would be elevated to also be an Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. And then 9 of them would be randomly chosen to serve on a panel that would deal with a selection of Supreme Court cases for 2 weeks. So basically, it would be a rotating system. There would be limits on the partisan composition of these justices, in the sense that no more than no more than 5 would be there for any, no more than 5 of the 9 on any panel would be appointed by a president of one particular political party. So no more than 5 Republicans or 5 Democrats. I like this idea because, one, you can't undo it. Once they're on the court, they are there for life. And two, so there's no like ratcheted up that I can think of. Maybe there's something possible that somebody hasn't thought of yet, but that's it. Once they're on, they're on. It also is something I like because it ends the risk of supermajorities. It's always 5 one way for the other, but it's never going to be 6-3 again. And so hopefully that takes the pot off the boil somewhat, because there are so many more justices, because you're not sure who's going to be on any given case. Everything is a little less, partisan at any given time. So I like that idea because it is specifically aimed at taking the pot off the boil. There's no real threats. It's just the system has changed. As far as I can see, this would be at least as constitutional as anything else proposed. And so I would like to do that irrespective of what the Supreme Court's decisions are, because I don't like how partisan things are now in terms of the confirmation process. I don't like the fact that there's a risk to the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. I think this restores that without causing the problem of a tit for tat issue. But I would not support the notion of just adding more justices to the court on its own without doing anything else to get the outcomes that I want, because I think that would last for a few years, and it would lead to the other side doing it in ways that are worse.
All right, Destiny,
Okay.
What's up?
I'm trying to think of where we go from here. So we've talked about the. Are there any points that either of you want to bring up in favor or against court packing that we haven't, like a topic that we haven't gone through?
I guess I would say this. Tinkering with the court is something that I think should also be done lightly, given the way that it's worked out in other countries.
Not be done lightly, or should be done lightly?
Or should not be done lightly.
Okay.
The way it's worked out in other countries. If, for example, the Democrats did that, the one that the Republicans would immediately howl about the most would be, they would talk about Venezuela, because Chavez added 12 justices, and since then the court has never ruled against him or Maduro. However, this isn't just, if we've got any Venezuela stands out here, this isn't just an issue of the far left. It's very salient, perhaps more salient with the far right, with respect to the regimes in Hungary, in Turkey, and in India. So any kind of
has
reform,
Poland sorry to interject, has Poland packed its courts or just retired all the liberal justices by force?
I think they I'm not 100% Poland.
Okay, that's fine.
Their strategy was they did something else with court reform where they I think increased their jurisdiction, and I guess I
okay, that's fair.
But basically they did something else to water down the court, I believe. But yeah, Poland would be on that list too. Like
sure.
And I think that I know that I think there are good reasons to be worried about what results being worse than what we've got, even if it is well-intentioned at the outset. So, and I guess that's one reason I'm very skeptical of a lot of constitutional reform generally, but I think we have good reason to be worried about any real substantive reform of courts that isn't done, with great care, and that is, that has with it the possibility of, I guess being ratcheted up in a real tit for tat fashion.
I guess the two things I would say about that is, I am aware, I think as far as I'm aware, England, it doesn't even have a written constitution. Yeah. The Supreme Court has no formal authority. It's just like an advisory body. It's like, oh no, you did an oopsie, you wrote a law that violates people's human rights. As are a bunch of like their other organizations. So I will say that it is possible to imagine even a United States where the Supreme Court doesn't have this supreme authority. I don't know that that's a better or worse United States. I tend to think that the Supreme Court probably makes the United States a better place to some degree. So on the one hand, it is possible to imagine a world where the Supreme Court has like significantly decreased legitimacy, and we still do as fine as the British, which I guess is, I don't know, that's kind of a low bar. But the other note I would say is, when we look at these examples of extreme court packing, as far as I'm aware, like it seems to be that they did it all at once. And I understand that there is this risk of like ratcheting up of escalation, but I think we're already in that mode. I guess I don't know that we can escape that. We've already seen like the increasing partisanship of lower court picks too. That's what's one of my problems with the lottery, actually. Well, now the Supreme Court picks won't be partisan. It's the lower courts, which already are partisan. So basically, my problem is I think we're already in the ratcheting up phase. I don't think that we can escape it per se. The question is, like, how do we use this ratcheting up to try and ratchet down? I actually posted a little quote in the group chat from the article by Epps and what's the other guy's name? Epps and Sitterman or something. Where they say, as David Posen has explained, it is possible to imagine hardball tactics to accomplish what he calls anti-hardball goals. That's kind of the proposal I'm suggesting here. Play hardball, escalate, and try to use that escalation to force it back down.
Yeah, I like the idea of playing hardball. What I don't like is the idea of basically, if the Republicans don't go for it, then implementing the full solution, because I think that would be a real harm to the institution. So I'm down to play. I guess I'm down to play hardball. But if I were to play with your solution, it would be kind of empty, because I still would not deem it to be worth pulling the trigger. I think that would do more harm than it would benefit.
Sure.
I guess I would. Oh, sorry. If you want to respond to that. The other thing I was going to say is, and this may be a point that I wasn't sure how, if this would come up or whether we disagree on it, but I would say that another position I am basically working on, and that other people might, like, this is one of my basic axioms here for my position, is that I think judicial review and the presence of a Supreme Court are unabashedly, not just important for our constitutional system in the United States, but a good thing. I view what they have in Great Britain and in other countries like Great Britain, basically parliamentary supremacy. Their parliament can do anything under the sun, and there is no constitution except what parliament says. So I don't know their jurisdiction of their Supreme Court enough to be able to comment on that. But I do know that the bedrock principle of British government is parliamentary supremacy. There is no court in the land that can tell Parliament to get fucked, because Parliament ultimately, at the end of the day, makes the rules. I don't like that as a form of government. I do like I like the fact that we in the United States do have some fundamentally, I guess, undemocratic, in the sense that Congress can be curbed, even if it represents the majority view, some undemocratic institutions like the Supreme Court that can say, look, Congress may have a supermajority that is, trying to infringe upon the First or Second or whatever amendment, but it doesn't matter because it violates the Constitution, and we in the Supreme Court can stop that. So I view that as a plus. I recognize, though, that does sometimes, maybe often, come at the expense of what, at least sometimes, because I agree with the studies. Sure. I agree with what you've cited when you say that the court tries not to go too far the way of public opinion. But I like that the court can stand as a check against that.
Sure. I guess I generally am not sure how strong the court is in protecting human rights. Because it generally goes along with the public opinion. If we had, like, tomorrow a 80% Nazi majority, all the Supreme Court is going to do is try and extend a few more human rights in the death camps. That they will follow public majority within enough percentage points that they can't undo demagoguery, genuine tyranny. So that's why Britain, even though it only has the advisory court, has stayed relatively free, because it has strong, like, institutions within its country, strong, like, voting constituencies that are interested in those freedoms. However, I will say, actually, I am pretty strongly in favor of the ability for the Supreme Court constitutional review. Context of, like, having pretty long terms. There's a lot of evidence that, like, lifetime appointment judges tend to rule in favor of minority groups, that they tend to rule in favor of, like, gay and black groups in the United States, for example, when they aren't exposed to elections, when they have these really long-term lifetime appointments. So I think that's really anti-majoritarian check. One of the questions is, if we think this is important, how do we make sure that the Supreme Court actually has that authority? And the answer, again, seems to me you have to have some way to actually give them constitutional review. They don't even have that power in the Constitution. It's something they interpreted for themselves in 1803, right?
Yeah, like, although it's hard, because, like, it's hard to, like, I know that Marbury versus Madison is where it becomes, like, official, but it's also in 1803, but it's hard to imagine how the Constitution even works without it. Like, that's the first time, I believe, that a federal law is overturned by the Supreme Court. But at the same time, I don't know that it would be, I don't know how you read, like, what the Supreme Court does if it doesn't have the power of judicial review. It can settle your personal case, but if it cannot determine,
but that's kind of the point, right? It's all about reading the Constitution. If you have delegitimized the body that reads the Constitution, who's going to do that reading? So the basic point that I'm trying to raise, I think you want to have more institutional guardrails that give the Supreme Court more power. We talked about how they don't have the army, they don't have the purse. I don't know what powers you would give to give them, like, more were, but that is the general direction I would like to see, like formal constitutional amendment to give them like constitutional review, formal constitutional amendment to somehow secure like their power of interpretation and enforcement.
Well, I don't
not enforcement, but like, you know what I mean. Sorry.
Yeah, I guess I don't really know like what that would look like, because one, I mean, they've already got judicial review, and then two, I don't know what you would give them to like make it so they could independently enforce their decisions. But what I would say is that I respect the notion. I will say this: if we're winding down and we're coming to an area where we at least share some objectives, I think it sounds like we have a similar objective in the sense of preserving long-term legitimacy. I just reject your way of getting there, and it sounds like you view my way of getting there as not the ideal way to get there.
I just don't think it's going to is basically the problem. I think that what's going to happen either is we're not going to do the court packing now, but someone 10 years from now is going to do the court packing. Whoever is in control of like, they're going to do the thing. And so ideally, I would like Democrats, who I think are more likely to actually want to reform the Supreme Court and make it nonpartisan at the current moment anyway, to use that to make it less partisan.
Yeah.
I think actually, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to mention, what's his face? Ro Khanna actually sponsored a bill which would implement those term limits. So there is like some support in Congress already to do these kind of things. I don't know that it's enough, but it's some.
Sure. I appreciate that folks are thinking about that kind of stuff. I personally would not want to, I don't want to touch the term limits, and they seem like one of the few things that like is super constitutionally hardwired about the Supreme Court. So I'd be skeptical of those going anywhere. But at the same time, I guess any reforms to court require going to the court at the end of the day. So it's hard to know.
Fair enough,
I guess. But that said, I would only say that I don't think it is inevitable that somebody is going to expand the Supreme Court any more than it was in the 1930s or than it was since. Indeed, I think it's less likely, given just the fact that the best history we have suggests that it's an easy way to ruin a majority.
Okay. I mean, I think both sides brought up good points. It sounds like either side is necessarily moved by the other. I think the difficulties of this argument is that I think it hinges on, I think there's a lot of fundamental groundwork that has to be laid. So for instance, not even is the court legitimate, but what is the job of the court? Is the job of the court to interpret the Constitution as well as possible, or is it to follow the will of the people, or is it to protect something like that? There's a lot to go into there. And then whether or not it's possible to do this and not suffer severe political consequences for it, or what could retaliation be in the future, all of these things are also kind of, we don't know, right?
Yeah.
Especially now, like everything is pretty unprecedented in terms of our political system. So, yeah, I mean, I don't think I can like declare a winner in any of these things unless somebody like literally starts screaming and leaves, or
you know what you could. Well, I know that
polling before and after.
You've picked, you could do some internet polls. Those are always
helpful
in determining the legitimate winner.
This is just not fair. You've got one order of magnitude more watchers. My God. He's rigging the polls. He's gerrymandering right now. He's Republican. I can see it in his eyes.
Well, I think you probably see it in the flag pin, but no, I'm not actually.
I might do polls before and after for some of these. It just
that could be an interesting thing.
Yeah, I have two big problems with polls. The first problem I have is that if one side has a major lead going into it, that side is almost always going to lose. So, for instance, let's say that we have a debate on whether or not necrophilia should be allowed, and like 98% of people are against it, right? And 2% of people are in favor of it. If I was to poll before and after, almost every single time, that 98%, that's probably going to drop by a couple points, right? You're not going to convince every single person, and the other person only has one. So like so like for heavily one-sided things, that's a problem. And then the second thing is that if there are certain people with massive imbalances in audiences, it also can heavily favor a poll in one way or another as well.
Yeah, that's true. Have you ever seen those Intelligence Squared debates?
I've not.
They do. They're on YouTube sometimes. It's like something they do in Britain. And they do before and after polling of the audience, but basically they pick an amount. I think it seems like the general feeling is the winner is whoever persuaded the most. So perhaps you could think up a threshold of how much you would want something to move one way or another. But
one thing I will say,
you could also just do nothing.
Yeah, what
from like statistical things, it is hard. the closer you get to like 1 in 100, sort of, like the closer you get to a very minority position, it's extremely hard to prove that you statistically significantly moved people, both because of like reporting errors, people just click the wrong button, and two, just because of basic statistical principles. So in general, I think that these polls would, for most of the issues you're talking about, it's not going to be 98-2. It's going to be like 30-70 or something, I would think. Particularly with like the audience that you've accumulated, Destiny, who seems to, right, incest is morally neutral and so on. You probably will get at least some people in favor of the necrophilia.
Yeah, sure.
So I guess my argument is it seems like most of these things, I don't think you'll have such extreme biases that you couldn't use some of the data. The other thing that I was going to mention, you might if you break a topic subtopics, and you had polling specifically on those issues, that could be interesting to say like, oh, the people's minds were changed on the legitimacy of the court, but they weren't changed at all on whether court packing is politically viable, sort of thing.
Yeah, it's a good idea. You do that.
Yeah. I'll think about this a lot in terms of, I don't want to make it overly complicated where it's like, all right guys, here's your 16 poll survey, we're gonna find out how before and after. Yeah, but I might try that in the future. I'm not sure.
Sure.
Okay, well, I don't know how I should end this. Could do closing statements, I guess. I think that I don't know if I should make my position known or not known, because I don't want to bias the audience, so I haven't thought of that.
Oh my
I like
God.
the idea of making my position known, because then so it avoids the obscuring of my bias. So for instance, if I say at the beginning, like, hey, just so you guys know, I'm against court packing, but I don't know if that would shade people's opinions of the debate, because they might think like, oh, well, Destiny's against it, the other guy's arguments are probably better. Or if Destiny's against it, he's asking questions just because he's biased against it. I haven't decided on that yet. What do you guys think?
You have a pretty big anti-jerk in your community. I don't know.
Yeah, well, I could just go on the other way then too, but
well, maybe I don't know. It sounds like maybe your ideal outcome is to just explain how independently what you thought of whether somebody was persuasive on one point or another, whether they shifted you in some way. Maybe that's just what you're looking for, as opposed to.
I know one thing I've been trying to do after I do like a debate with someone or conversation is I do like a little steel man of like, what were my positions coming in? What did I change? And what do I think the strongest argument they raised were about that issue? Just to try and present like the best faith interpretation of changes to whatever, which of course never happens. I'm always right, but.
Yeah, I think, okay, well, I guess in that sense then, everything that Bastiat said are all things that I agree with. I think that once you go down this road, it's stuff that would be really worrisome, that it could happen more and more in the future. And that also it's hard to say what type of political capital would be needed to enact these changes, and what type of political capital you would lose by enacting these changes. So that everything he said are like arguments that I've heard and am warm to in the past. Something that you said though, so a huge problem that I have when it comes to court packing is that you're basically saying like, okay, we're in power, we're going to get our way, screw it. And then the next people to come along is like, well, now we're in power, we're going to get our way, screw it. And I don't know how to overcome that problem. But your suggestion about expanding the justice limits to 4 and filling 2, and then holding those other 2 hostage and saying, hey, we're going to balance the courts now. If you don't want to, I'm pulling the trigger on these 2 justices, and now your majority is fucked. That's an argument that I haven't heard before. Unfortunately, it sounds like it's out of like a movie. Like it would only work like in a fucking Hollywood, like, and it would be awesome and dramatic when they do the movie. But I worry that like in the real world, it would literally play out like the Democrats are holding the court hostage. Look at what they're trying to do, and it's going to be so bad. I don't know if that would work in real life, but that idea is really cool. I like that idea.
One thing I will say, that idea actually comes from the two articles actually on this issue. The one from Epps that Bastiat is citing, and the one from what's his face? I don't even remember. They're both making explicit like constitutional hardball arguments about these sort of things. So I think if you do want to read them, like 30 pages each or something, very interesting reads.
Yeah, no, it's both of us picked. We picked good hills to die on these, because it's not just like nonsense from Twitter. It's like these are academics who know their stuff, even if they come to different conclusions. The one thing I would say is I would be curious if how this kind of stuff has worked in the past, like with other subjects. Like, I don't know if anybody's ever done this with the Supreme Court, but I wonder if I don't know how all the debt ceiling negotiations worked out, but I'd be curious like how those have worked out in the past, because that's kind of the last example I could think of somebody saying, support this or else I'm gonna wreck you.
Well, we kind of do that with the budget, don't we? With our huge budget.
Yeah, like I would be curious how if somebody's looked at, and I'm not saying I would be curious as a way of saying you're wrong. I'm just saying I'm genuinely would be curious whether that kind of tactic has like worked in the past with other subjects. Maybe it has. Maybe people have,
Yeah, no, that's a good example. Do some research.
Like whether people who have taken that approach in budget negotiations have typically done better as a result, or worse.
Okay. Do you guys feel like the guided discussion is an okay setup, or should it be more free forming, or should it be more strict in terms of like these are the 6 topics we're gonna go down? So basically, I'm listening to both of your opening statements, and then I'm kind of asking you guys questions to kind of guide the discussion to move from A to B. Do you think that's an okay format, or do you think like I think it'd be better for us to just talk and hammer it out? And I don't like when you stop me going to this point or blah blah blah. What do you think?
You want to go first?
Yeah, go. Aiden.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I was asking if you want to go first.
Sure.
Sure.
I only heard the last 3 words you said. I go first.
Okay.
Okay.
Sure.
I'll say I'll say that I thought it was pretty good. The I guess the difference I would say is when I think about this kind of stuff, I think about some of the panel shows I've done. The panel shows I've done the panel shows that are totally free form are no fun, and they are of course unproductive. The panel shows that are tightly controlled are similarly unfun, even if they are probably more productive. They are not very much fun, which is the ultimate reason we're all here at the end of the day, right? There are shows though, like for example, Dylan's Hippy Dippy podcast, where he does a pretty good job, I think, of splitting those. Tree of Logic has done that approach too, and I think what you did was closer to that. So I think that's a good approach. There may be times where maybe you would not want to come in as much one way or another, but I thought it was pretty good. I mean, because it seemed like you're trying to keep us honest to our points rather than just like, for example, you called me out, I think, earlier in the debate.
Trying to move to a different argument about political capital.
Yes, and that was true. And I wasn't even intending to just I'm going to ignore your argument. That's just where my brain went. But it was good that I thought it was good. I imagine you thought it was good, Aiden, that we stuck to the main point. So, maybe there are times where that would be suppressive. I didn't really get that sense tonight, but I thought that was pretty good. What did you think, Aiden?
No, I was going to say I the the boxing of the debate where you're like, we're going to finish one topic first, and even what you might want to do, like the whole steel manning thing, at the end of each bit, you might want to like try and come to some sort of conclusion, like this is where we've landed on this topic, and now we're just going to leave it. We're not going to go back to that. Because I know in some debates, I think in general, we pretty cleanly moved from talking about legitimacy to talking about like political sort of issues, but some people might want to really, really go back. And so if you just... I would say slightly more structure in terms of like in the future might be necessary to make sure that people keep moving through. I think on stream you drew like these 3 lines or whatever to indicate like logical flow. If you like indicated that like you wanted a vertically structured debate where you're like premise, conclusion, and you want to make sure for each one where like you don't go back to previous. That's a at least making sure that we get to the conclusion anyway, instead of doing the just scatterbrain 6 people talking about a million topics because they're all on Twitter.
Especially if we like knew in advance, then it would be cool to maybe like prepare something like that.
Sure, yeah, okay. So for conversation, so I picked you 2 because Bastiat. I mean, you're Bastiat, you're awesome. And then Aiden, you're very intelligent. You're one of the only socialists that like puts together well-reasoned arguments, and you like my videos, so you must be cool. No, but like both of you guys are obviously very cordial, are capable of having a discussion or whatever. Do you think that this type of format could work if I had people like Sargon of Akkad or Lecture Fan, or do you think that I would be accused of being horrendously biased? Do you think it would be a really good format for them, or because I think on the next debate that I do for this, I think I want to pick a lot more charged figures, see if I can rein in those conversations, or if it'll just be a nightmare.
I think it's a gradient. The closer the people are to being able to moderate themselves, the less you got to moderate it, and then the closer they are unable to doing it, the more you got to moderate it. It's not like a binary point.
Yeah. The thing that's challenging is that ultimately, I guess I thought we would disagree more on our goals, but I think we have similar goals. It's about how to get there. And I think with other debates where it's like,
you're a socialist too? Happy to hear.
No, but I don't think what you're proposing, I mean, maybe it is to you a step towards socialism. I don't see it as even what you proposed to me. That doesn't seem like a step towards socialism any more than anything else that is just designed to maintain a good society, right? I don't think that is ipso facto socialism. But that said, that's interesting to think about. I don't know. I guess really you just got to try. I will say, though, that having what you did with us, holding us to the points we're talking about, and then what Aiden proposed, where you might have some of those in advance, would probably really help with that. Because at least then, when you're shouting at a Lecture Fan or Sargon of Akkad, hey, stick to the point. You have points. some basic points that you all agreed would be discussed.
It
And
does
so-
get harder to say bias, right? Like if you put the rules up front, like, hey, I'm going to go through this structure, I'm going to hold you to it, and then they complain, well, your fault.
Yeah. So, and I mean, I think that it's good to, I mean, I don't think there's any reason that like debates or discussions like this should only be like with cordial people. I think those are good sometimes. I feel like as a cordial people, I'm glad that I can do this kind of stuff sometimes. But, I mean, I don't think that I think you could totally do this, with firebrands and still have it be something good that isn't just a mess.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, cool. Well, hey, listen, I appreciate both you guys coming on. It's been fun. Yeah, I'll see you guys around. I don't really have anything else to say with you. So.
Well, hey, Aiden, it was good meeting you. Good talking to you. I'm sure
it was great to meet you, and I just want to give a big shout out to Joe Biden, my best friend Joe Biden. On November 3rd, he would really appreciate if you voted at the polls, okay?
Nice. Oh, yeah, I guess we definitely should end with that. Bastiat, what is the best place for people to find you?
Twitch.tv/BASTIAT. Check it out. Lots of fun dreams, neoliberal memes. We have a good time. And of course, I am riding with Diamond Joe Biden as well. So I'm glad we all agree on that.
Oh, also, don't you run like a news network or something?
Yeah, so there is a okay. Well, I'm glad you brought this up. There is a Bastiat news network that I don't run and that I threatened with a lawsuit and that will never be coming back. All right. So the Bastiat News Network never coming back. Not my project. Fake news. The Rarest Pepper and Gondom who run it are criminal trolls who should be ashamed of themselves. And I just want to say, if BNN ever comes back, and I've heard it might be making a return this month, I am looking forward to some hot legal action. Now, we did, however, have an attorney on the stream a couple of days ago who said that the Bastiat News Network is actually totally protected by the First Amendment as a totally legitimate form of parody. So I don't know how well the next legal threat is going to go after that.
Wait, aren't you? You don't like own the name Bastiat, no?
No, I don't. No, it's not. They claim that it's not about me. All right. But, they have managed to really sour a lot of relationships I had. They're also posting these ridiculous stories about me and having a weight problem. And it's just really offensive stuff. So, oh my God, they're back.
Yeah, I just noticed. Posted 23 minutes ago. We are back.
Oh, no.
Oh, my God.
On the anniversary of 9/11, Bastiat sent BNN a cease and desist. Wow.
Well, look, it's a shame that they, chose that day to never forget.
Okay, well, this is quite the article.
Oh, let me shout myself out, okay?
Yeah,
Socialism
okay,
done left. Google it. I'm anywhere. Done.
Cool. All right. Well, hey, listen, I love you guys both. I appreciate you coming on, and thanks for joining us. We will